It wasn't long after they were married that Bobby began nagging Ethel about money. Her extravagance would be a source of irritation and conflict throughout their marriage. When Ethel's bills began flowing in from stores in Palm Beach, New York, and Boston, Rose Kennedy ordered Bobby to get his bride in line. Bobby's warnings, however, were met with blank stares from Ethel, who had no conception whatsoever about budgeting money. When one of the Kennedys called to tell her that her checking account was overdrawn, Ethel was shocked. "It can't be," she responded with all innocence. "I still have some checks left." One evening at the dinner table at Hyannisport, Joe Kennedy angrily brought up the subject of frivolous spending. Glaring, he turned to Ethel and declared her the worst of the lot, a wild spender with no regard for the value of a dollar. Knowing that Joe's angry criticism would devastate Ethel, she'd been working so hard to earn his respect, Bobby told his father that his point had been well taken. But Ethel jumped up from the table and ran from the room, tears brimming in her eyes, her face crimson with embarrassment. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Cheer Denise, and today we're going to keep going in The Other Mrs. Kennedy. This section is insane, and largely because Ethel has had a pretty good life so far. She's had everything she ever wanted. She's been able to spend daddy's money. There hasn't ever really been anything hard, and whatever she ever butted up against, she found a way to maneuver her way out of it so she could do it her way. And life has just been kind of like one silly little episode after another. One little screwball set of hijinks after another. And there really hasn't been anything very difficult. I think the most difficult thing she ever came up against was when she was sort of wrestling between, do I want to be Bobby's wife and be a Kennedy, or should I go be a nun? And I think that she made the mistake that I think a lot of young Catholic people make. When they come up against something hard for the first time, their immediate thought is, I need to go run and hide in the church. I need to go and be a nun. I need to go and become a priest. I need to go and be something. I need to go and hide behind the church to shelter myself from hard decision making. And I've seen this happen several times to friends of mine who are Catholics. It seems like all of them have come up to a point where it's like, I have to choose my vocation. Will it be the church or will it be, the typical married life? And I do know that is a question. Do I join the church? Is that my vocation, or is family my vocation? I'm not saying the question itself is the problem. You actually do need to ask yourself the question. But it seems so often like whenever there's a difficult choice in life, and there's this idea of like, I might have to go and be an adult in the world, there's this immediate reaction of, maybe this is the sign. Maybe this means I'm supposed to go to the church. But I sometimes feel like it's born more out of fear of making a hard decision and kind of like trying to hide behind the apron of the church, like a little kid might hide behind their mother, So I think for the first time she had to ask a question that was bigger than herself. There's no little prank that you can pull to get yourself out of figuring out this one. So that was something that she really had to struggle with. Though later in life she really downplayed it and act like, it had never been a time of introspection for her. So this next section of the book is full of times when life is handing her all kinds of stuff and she can't just pull a prank or be silly or squirt a water gun or just throw a big party to cover it. She's having babies now and she's not experiencing happy pregnancies. This idea that she just kind of bounced through the world, as this like pregnant mother, just, popping out babies and was so cheerful about it. No. And her first pregnancy was difficult. Her first delivery was very painful. There were problems. And she largely kept those problems to herself because she was a very private person when it came to her body and she didn't really talk to anybody about it. She has one baby, like literally 3 months later, she's pregnant again. And there's just a lot that she's trying to handle. On top of that, his family is very upset with the way she spends money. She's never known any bounds on how to spend money. She was allowed to spend however and wherever and how much. And now she's part of a family that is much more strict when it comes to money. They're penny pinchers to the extreme, to the point of being real stingy when it comes to tipping help and things like that. And so that's not the world she's come from. She's going to be chastised in this section from Joe Kennedy, who's going to embarrass her in front of the family by calling her out. And so she's really meeting some difficulties in life in this section. And it's just interesting to see the way that she reacts. And, because she was private about a lot of the things that she thought and felt, We don't get a lot of quotes from her about how people say she felt, but it's just observational as to what was going on and how her demeanor began to shift around those who knew her. So I found this section to be extremely interesting. I hope you find it as interesting as well. But we're going to start. They're still at law school. There's no babies just at the moment. And there's lots of drama leading up to the first baby. So lots of drama in their marriage, lots of drama in her family. There's just lots going on. So let's get to it. Chapter 38 says Perfect Partner. Ethel worked hard to become the Pearl Mesta of UVA, throwing parties related to Bobby's involvement with the Student Legal Forum. The purpose of the forum, which had been languishing for several years, was to bring interesting speakers to the university. Bobby, who saw the SLF as an opportunity to get some attention, used the power and prestige of his name to get elected president. His father's prominent connections all but guaranteed a headline-making list of speakers. That year, they included Senator Joseph McCarthy, Ralph Bunche, Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas, and even Joe Kennedy himself. Ethel decided that before each appearance, a select group of students and faculty would be invited to the house to meet the guest speaker over drinks, followed by dinner. Ethel wanted those gatherings to be memorable. Anne Marie O'Hagan Murphy's mother suggested an Austrian cook who had recently moved to Charlottesville and was earning a reputation for her exquisite European dishes. The woman agreed to cater the first party, which was a huge success. But several months later, she telephoned Mrs. O'Hagan. She said, "I'm terribly embarrassed to tell you this, but my bill to that young Kennedy girl has never been paid." Mother, who was very proper, was horrified, Anne Marie recalled. So she came to me and she told me to call Ethel, which I did. Ethel told me, "Oh, of course it's been paid. That's ridiculous." And I said, "Well, Ethel, you check and make sure." A couple of months later, this woman called my mother again. She still had not been paid. Whether Ethel paid the chef or not, and years later, she would get a reputation for being difficult with help and stiffing vendors. That's the same thing her mom did. And see, that's what I'm saying. When it came to spending money on herself, she had no trouble with it. She would spend money all day on herself, but when it came to actually paying for the services that she had received, she was very much like her mother. And, some of the other family members were big tippers, but it doesn't seem like Ethel got that part of being a Skakel. She got her mother's stinginess. One of Bobby's early speakers was Congressman Kennedy, about to embark on his first senatorial campaign. Ethel had overseas preparation for an elaborate dinner for Jack that was scheduled for 7-ish. By 7:45, Jack still hadn't arrived, and a frantic Ethel and a furious Bobby decided to go ahead and serve dinner. As the others ate, Bobby and Ethel huddled in the kitchen. "How could that son of a bitch do this to me?" Bobby yelled, pounding the table. "I can't believe this," hissed Ethel in agreement. "I'll kill Jack, I swear it." Bobby feared that he'd be left in the lurch in the last minute without a speaker. As everyone was nervously finishing dinner, the front door opened, and the handsome congressman strode in, acting as if nothing was amiss. Ethel and Bobby turned from Jack, their face frozen in disbelief, to his companion, a heavily made-up beauty with wild hair who was dressed in a short, tight black skirt, tight purple sweater, and platform high heels. "She was," recalled Anne Marie O'Hagan Murphy, "a bimbo like you have never seen. She was French and pretended she couldn't speak English, but she obviously understood everything that was going on." Ethel and Bobby were furious. "Where the hell have you been?" Ethel sputtered. "Well, we had to stop at the motel and check in," Jack explained, growing more sheepish as his sister-in-law's wrath intensified. "You know I told you I was fixing up the guest room for you. I had flowers in the room and everything," Ethel said. "Well," said Jack with finality, bringing an end to Ethel's scolding, "I'm staying at the motel." Recalled Murphy, Ethel had worked very hard because usually they didn't have house guests. She'd fixed up one room and had no idea that he was coming down with anybody. She'd tried hard to make things nice for him. After all the commotion, Jack went and gave a wonderful talk, but it was quite a scene at the house. And let's just recall the kind of chaos that she came from, even though she had money. We've read chapter after chapter after chapter after chapter of how chaotic Lake Avenue House was. And you recall that the first time she stayed with the Kennedys, one of the things that she really liked about it was the niceties that were offered in the room, the flowers, the books on the bedside table. All these little things had been laid out to make it nice for a guest, and she'd noted it then and filed it away for when she had her own house, how she wanted it to be. So here she had had her opportunity to exercise some of the things she'd been watching go on in her mother-in-law's in-laws' house, and now she wanted to extend that. And, the first time you host somebody, the first couple of times you host somebody, especially as a newlywed, you want it to be really nice. And so for that to sort of just be ignored, and all the anxieties of hoping that you'd done it right and made it nice, and then the person's like, well, I'm staying in the motel, and was late to your dinner, I think any of us would have been miffed about that. But why in the world is Jack showing up with this, clear bimbo? Was he trying to embarrass his younger brother? Was he trying to mess it up? Or was he just so in his own world with this girl that he kind of didn't really care about what happened with Bobby? I don't think it was necessarily probably intentional that he did this. I think he's just that selfish that he didn't think about how Bobby would feel in that situation with his brother being late and then bringing somebody who clearly wasn't prepared to be at, a nice event. Another guest of Bobby's who sparked controversy was Joe McCarthy, then at the peak of his power. McCarthy had become a close friend of Joe Kennedy's, and therefore his aims and goals were supported by Bobby, Jack, and the rest of the clan. Jack had met McCarthy in the South Pacific during the war. Later, McCarthy and the Kennedys had started socializing, and Joe even had a couple of dates with Jean and Pat. McCarthy once laughingly boasted that if things got really bad for him, he could always marry a Kennedy girl. Later, McCarthy and Jack served together in Congress. They both used their wartime experiences, Jack's PT-109 story, and Joe's tailgun tale, to enhance their images and aid their elections. After McCarthy made his historic speech charging that communists had infiltrated the State Department, Joe Kennedy decided that Joe McCarthy was definitely his kind of politician. A conservative Irish Catholic, an isolationist, a rabid anti-communist. Following his father's lead, Bobby would eventually work for McCarthy, had become an ardent supporter of the senator, and McCarthyism. Ethel felt the same way. She was strongly Catholic, and she felt that communist teachings were against the Catholic religion, Jerry Tremblay observed. Ethel's mother had contributed heavily to the anti-communist Christophers, headed by Father Keller, a one-time candy maker and Maryknoll missionary. For a time, Keller, a close friend of McCarthy's, had rent-free offices in Great Lakes Carbon Midtown Manhattan headquarters. Prior to getting married, Ethel's sister Pat had become one of Keller's top speakers, lecturing to young people that, quote, Christians should work as hard for Christianity as communists were working for communism. At Keller's direction, Pat Skakel also infiltrated Manhattan's Jefferson School of Social Science, described in feverish patriotic prose in Look magazine as, quote, the place where commies are trained. As part of her spy network, Pat had enlisted the help of her gun-toting brother George and Martin McNally. What a motley crew. These people at the school thought Pat and the rest of us were communist sympathizers, recalled Alice Appy Whitney Lorillard, a socialite friend of the Skakel-Kennedy girls. Appy, who had converted to Catholicism through the good graces of Pat Skakel and Sergeant Shriver, recalled that Pat's group not only developed intelligence about Jefferson School students, but waged a dirty tricks campaign. The school sent out petitions for various communist causes, she said. At the end of classes each night, we'd collect all the school's literature and pamphlets and throw them away. We thought it was loads of fun. Father Keller was happy as a clam. Jack McCrae, a Greenwich boy who dated Anne Skakel when she was in high school and he was at Harvard, remembered discussions at Lake Avenue that, quote, Joe McCarthy was, in the Skakel eyes, a great person. It was that horrendous time when the Rosenbergs were executed, and I remember that didn't seem to bother Ethel or Anne a whit, he said. That's kind of outrageous. Do you guys remember that? When that husband and wife were convicted of being spies, and then they were sent to the electric chair, and, there was a sort of a contingency of people who were very excited by that, who felt like, good deeds had been done, people who, the bad guys had been put to death and all this. And, there were heavy feelings about it. I think whether you thought it was right or whether you thought it was wrong, you should have some feelings about the humanity involved. But Ethel and Anne, that was too deep for them. When Bobby mentioned to Ethel that he thought he would get McCarthy to speak at the university, she was thrilled. Such a visit would be a major coup for Bobby. McCarthy accepted, and Ethel immediately dove into planning her most lavish party to date. At the Kennedy house that evening, McCarthy was in an exuberant and playful mood. Ethel and Bobby weren't big drinkers, but Ethel kept refilling McCarthy's glass. I found him rather terrifying, a terrible fanatic, said Sue Drake, who helped Ethel with the party. As McCarthy got progressively inebriated, he asked everyone to gather round the sofa. Let me show you what I have here, he said, slurring his words, as he opened his briefcase with shaky hands and retrieved a dark metal object. It was a loaded gun, said Sue Drake, still shaken up by the memory years later. It was shocking. He showed it to us and we stood around gaping, and Ethel just laughed. The gun didn't faze her a bit. She liked McCarthy. I could tell Bobby was intrigued with what power had done for McCarthy. Here's the thing. Would Ethel have been scared at all about somebody pulling a loaded gun out of a briefcase? That's what her brothers did all day long. We know the stories about the brothers riding around, one brother, riding shotguns, shooting mailboxes and shooting into the night. A loaded gun being pulled out of a briefcase is like, oh, I'm home again. Next to Joe McCarthy, Dr. Ralph Bunche was Robert's most controversial guest. Bobby had extended the invitation with the full knowledge that the visit by the Black Nobel Prize winner and director of the United Nations Department of Trusteeship would cause trouble on the all-white campus. Bunche's agreement to come to Charlottesville, announced in a banner headline in the March 9, 1951 issue of UVA's Cavalier Daily, caused a firestorm of protests by segregationists who had the backing of the state law that banned blacks from white meeting halls. But Bobby stood firm. He and another member of the Student Legal Forum fought for and eventually received the support of the university. In late March, Bunche spoke before an integrated audience, about a third black. It had become traditional for Bobby, Ethel, and their friends to take the guest speaker to Farmington Country Club for drinks or a late supper. But the manager of the club told Bobby he couldn't have a black guy, recalled Gary Tremblay. That was a blow to Bobby. But Bobby and Ethel maintained their membership. That's interesting. It just kind of undermines what he had done in fighting for this Nobel Prize winner who should have had every right to be on any campus he wanted to. Bobby fought for him to come and speak, despite the stupid segregationist laws that said a black person couldn't come to a white meeting hall. But then you try to take this gentleman to the country club and he's denied. So embarrassing. He's denied. And you maintain your membership there. It just makes it feel like Bobby was bringing somebody to the campus and fighting for him, not because he necessarily cared about that man's rights, but because he wanted the power of telling the school what to do and forcing them to change rules. But I don't necessarily feel like it's because he thought the change in the rule was superior, because he wasn't looking to change any rules in his own personal life. He wasn't looking to go to a different country club or to fight for laws and rules to be changed at the country club that he attended. I think that Bobby looked at McCarthy, saw the power that McCarthy had, that McCarthy could do anything, and he decided to make waves where he could, not because he cared so much about the change of the law, but because he liked the power of being the one to say, no, you're going to do it my way. And the only reason he didn't push at the country club is because he liked the country club and he wanted to, he didn't want to get kicked out or anything, causing too much trouble there, and the country club was another form of power. Being a member of that country club meant he rubbed elbows with people who had other power. He couldn't be kicked out of that. Anyway, maybe he really was genuinely concerned about the rights of Dr. Ralph Bunche, and maybe he was just a fledgling in his care and concern, and maybe I'm being too harsh. We all have to start somewhere, and so maybe, this fledgling push to get him on campus was all he was able to manage then as he began to grow and mature in his understanding of equality, but which I think is a charitable view and possibly true, but it does make you wonder. Anyway, looking back over that year, Sue Drake observed that Ethel never offered an opinion about the people Bobby invited to speak. She just entertained them. My analysis is simply that Ethel worshipped Bobby and she would do anything for him, and she wasn't about to criticize his opinions or anything else about him. She was totally under his spell. Well, she sure was. She's pregnant now, so she's not in a position to question anything he does. They're about to have a kid together. In June 1951, 124 young men graduated from the law school at the University of Virginia. Bobby Kennedy ranked 56th in that group, with a mediocre grade point average of 2.54. Bobby didn't wait around to get his diploma. A month before graduation, he and Ethel quietly vacated the house on Cameron Lane and flew north to the Skakel estate in Greenwich, where they moved into one of the two guest houses to await the birth of their first baby. When Ethel had joyously revealed her pregnancy to Bobby the previous winter, around the time of his 25th birthday, he had been elated. Not only was he the first Kennedy male of his generation to get married, but now he'd be the first to father a member of the next generation. He would finally gain his father's attention and respect by making him a proud grandfather. Ethel, too, was proud. She had quietly pledged when she married Bobby to have more babies than his mother because she knew such a feat would impress the matriarch, prove to Rose that she had the Kennedy grit. Now she was about to start fulfilling that promise. Ethel and Bobby's timing couldn't have been better. As Rose later noted, Joe and I began to wonder when we were going to have grandchildren. Bobby blazed the trail. Did he ever? Beginning in the late 1950s, when Bobby first started making his mark in Washington, an avalanche of glowing newspaper and magazine articles were written about Ethel, the sprightly young Kennedy wife who seemed to live in cute maternity outfits. The stories, written mainly by Catholic women reporters who idolized the Kennedys, helped establish Ethel's all-American image. The fact is that Ethel never looked forward to her early pregnancies. She actually abhorred any form of physical discomfort and had an extremely low threshold for even the most minor ache or pain. That's an interesting statement, because she was a very athletic person, and riding horses and falling off horses and things like that, she didn't seem to mind the pain then. And that is one of my contentions with this book, is that I feel like there's a lot of contradictory statements based on things they've previously said. Have we not already established the fact that she, would put herself in pretty painful situations in order to accomplish a goal, on horseback or on the sports field and things like that? But now we're told that she couldn't stand any personal pain. So I don't know. Maybe that is true. But regardless, her pregnancies were difficult. Ethel was sick and quite miserable through that first pregnancy, said Sue Drake. She was basically terrified by the whole thing. She wanted to do what was right, but she was scared. And you have to think, and I'm sorry, this will be like I'll stop with all the side notes, but when you consider the paltry amount that she probably had learned about her own body, having been talked to about sex by the nuns, but nobody ever mentioned anything about sperm, it's like, how much did she really know about what was going on with her body? Maybe she did, and maybe I'm just underselling, the experience that she had under the nuns' tutelage, and maybe there were people who explained more to her. Maybe her mother had explained more to her, although I highly doubt it. But I just think how scary it would be to be pregnant and not really know much about what was happening or what was okay, or, which aches and pains were typical and what you needed to be worried about. Being pregnant would be very scary if you didn't know what was happening to your body. And you didn't necessarily feel comfortable reading about what was happening to your body, or, I don't know how comfortable she was with her body, but it does say later in this chapter that she didn't find it easy to talk to others about what was physically happening to her. And there was one nurse she spoke to, but it was really outside of her personality to even express and expose as much as she did to that nurse, but we'll get there. Anyway, as Drake and other friends recalled, Ethel stopped virtually all forms of physical activity, acting more like a patient preparing for major surgery than a joyful mother-to-be, the picture that has been part of the Ethel Kennedy myth for so long. Now on the verge of giving birth at Lake Avenue, she was anxious and blue, according to friends who saw her. Ethel was almost 2 weeks overdue when she finally went into labor. The whole family was in the sitting room watching television, recalled a relative, and Ethel just started screaming bloody murder. Bobby was there and helped her to get in the car, and they rushed her to Greenwich Hospital. On July 4th, 1951, 3 months after her 23rd birthday, in a very painful and physically debilitating delivery that would leave her in pain for days, Ethel gave birth to a healthy daughter whom she and Bobby named Kathleen after his late sister. But Ethel came out of the delivery room still anxious. Bobby, who had never seen her that way, felt helpless and telephoned his mother in Hyannisport. On her advice, he called the other important woman from his childhood, Luella Hennessy, who had been the Kennedy family nurse since the late 1930s. An integral part of our family, the person we looked to first when any one of us needed skilled or loving nursing care, as Rose Kennedy put it. Over the years, the nurse would attend the births of 26 of the Kennedy grandchildren, including all of Ethel's. Of all the Kennedy women, Ethel was her favorite. A day or two after the baby was born, Bobby called her and said, "Would you come down right away and take care of Ethel? She really needs you," the nurse recalled years later. What Hennessy encountered in Ethel's sunlit, flower-filled private room at Greenwich Hospital was a depressed young woman upset about the recent past, gloomy about the future. Ethel had a lot of problems, the nurse said. I wouldn't call it a nervous breakdown. I would just say it was exaggerated anxiety. It was a very difficult, quite hard delivery for Ethel, and she was suffering when I got there. According to Hennessy, Ethel had torn during the delivery, and she had also suffered, quote, an uncommon, unexpected internal injury because the baby was big and Ethel wasn't. It caused lots of pain and discomfort, and it worried Ethel quite a bit because it could have been permanent. Ethel's quite a private person, and I don't think she ever told anyone about it, not even Bobby. I wonder what happened to her. After a few days, Ethel's pain subsided and the injury healed, but her anxiety lingered. Adding to her troubled mood was the fact that she couldn't nurse Kathleen, who had to be fed by bottle, according to Hennessy. Always private, rarely communicative about her inner feelings, typical Skakel and Kennedy traits, Ethel suddenly opened up to the nurse. She told me Bobby was studying all the time, and they had just a little house in Charlottesville. She had friends down there, but nothing like her friends from Manhattanville. With her old friends, she could discuss intimate things. In Charlottesville, Ethel didn't have that luxury. She didn't have her mother or father or an aunt or an old friend to help her. She felt she had been thrown into pregnancy far away from home. Nothing in her life was settled, and that bothered her. She was concerned that she didn't have her own home with Bobby to go back to. She didn't feel it was natural going back to her parents' house. After hearing her story, Hennessy came away with a different view of Ethel than most of her friends had. She saw her as emotionally immature and isolated, unhappy with certain aspects of her marriage. Ethel always put on such a good front for everybody, no matter how she felt, said the nurse, but she was really blue. Yeah, I think it would be hard to be Ethel because it seems like Bobby was the director and she was just an actress on stage and he told her what to do. But she was not like a partner. She was not his partner. And I think that he called the shots and she just did the dance. But to have a baby and not have a home to take it to because they've left Charlottesville, he's graduated. And they're living in her parents' guest house. And we're going to see, like, they don't have their own house for a long time. I mean, long in the sense that, once you start having kids and stuff, you want a settled place that call your own. They're either at her parents' house or she's being shuttled over to Hyannisport, but there's no one place that belongs to them. And that would have a very unsettling feeling, especially as you're trying to start your own family. It would never have anything to do with the fact that we don't have proper accommodations. I mean, her parents had very lavish guest houses on their property, but you want a place that you know belongs to you. 2 weeks after giving birth, Ethel took Kathleen home to Lake Avenue. While Ethel waited in a wheelchair, her father went to the hospital office to deal with the discharge. "Every time I've taken my children down here to Greenwich Hospital," he told Hennessy, "I've always had to pay the bill. But today it goes to Robert Kennedy." On the big day, though, Bobby was out of town on Kennedy family matters and didn't turn up until later, after George Skakel had picked up the hospital tab. When she got home, the first thing Ethel did was order a dozen red roses for Rose Kennedy, a tradition that she'd follow after each of her 11 births. For Ethel and baby Kathleen, the reception at Lake Avenue was subdued. Mrs. Skakel didn't seem worried about Ethel's physical and emotional state whatsoever, recalled Hennessy, surprised by the family's reaction. There just wasn't a lot of warmth. The nurse was billeted in one of the guest houses with the baby, while Ethel and Bobby stayed in the main house. That's interesting. I mean, I guess since Ethel wasn't breastfeeding the baby, because, she couldn't, there wasn't necessarily the need for her to be right there, but it does seem strange. I don't think I would like that. I mean, for me, putting the baby in the nursery every night was hard for me because I just was like, what if something happens? But in a completely separate house with somebody else watching the newborn, that would be hard for me. But each morning, Kathleen was delivered to Ethel, and each afternoon and evening she was taken back to the cottage for her naps and sleep. Bobby seemed delighted, happy that his first child was a daughter. Hennessy recalled him remarking, "You can cuddle and pick up a little girl. Little boys are different. You can love a little girl." Bobby thought long and hard on whom to name as his firstborn's godfather and finally chose Joe McCarthy. Isn't that interesting what he said about how you can love a little girl, but little boys are different? I think men do, I think some men are really afraid of having a boy. I think that the idea of having boys and having to teach them what it is to be a man really terrifies a lot of men, and they would prefer to have daughters because of that. After several weeks, Luella Hennessy was relieved of her duties. She returned home, and the Kennedys and their new baby moved into one of the guest houses next to the Dowdles. They lived there while Bobby studied for the New York bar, said Sue Drake. The Drakes had moved north to nearby New Rochelle, and Bobby and Phil Drake cracked the law books together. That's what that summer was devoted to, a whole group of them studying for the bar. Seems kind of cozy. At summer's end, Bobby and Ethel decided they needed a break. It had been such a difficult and stressful year. Leaving the baby in the care of a nurse and the Skakel family, they headed west to visit Ethel's Manhattanville pal, Courtney Murphy Benoist, in Salt Lake City. There they met up with Bobby's college chum, Dean Markham, who worked as a salesman in his in-law's fabric business. The foursome drove to Moab, where Ethel made her first visit to the Skakel Ranch, and the friends drove into the Mojave Desert, quenching their thirst with cantaloupes grown at the ranch. After 2 weeks, Bobby and Ethel, relaxed for the first time in months, returned east. He to begin his career, she to start the full-time job of being a Kennedy wife and mother. But not with a house yet. No home. They don't live anywhere that is their home. Now, this next chapter is very, very distressing. Now, I just want to say before we read this chapter that the word retarded is used quite frequently in this chapter because this book was published in 1994 when it had not been decided that that word was politically incorrect. We're all grown-ups, we can manage it, but I'm just putting that out there. The author is not trying to be derogatory in any sense of the word. It's just the way in 1994 one would express the limitations of a person. All right, the chapter begins by saying that in Greenwich, on a beautiful Indian summer day in October 1951, in the first few weeks of her second pregnancy, Ethel's sister Georgianne went sailing on their mother's boat, the Anne, with her husband Johnny and her brother George. As the day progressed, Georgianne became increasingly ill. At first she thought she was seasick, or that she was getting the flu. She was nauseous and had a terrible headache, a painful sore throat. Concerned about his wife, Johnny instructed George to head for home. By the time they reached Lake Avenue, Georgianne had a raging fever and a rash. Frantic with worry, Dowdle telephoned the family doctor, who rushed to the house. His examination showed that Georgianne had rubella, or German measles, which could cause damage to the baby. His diagnosis floored the Skakels and devastated Georgianne. While the doctor tried to reassure Georgianne, she fell into a dark depression. Now, I don't think that we'd been told that Georgianne was pregnant for a second time, but she is, and so of course this could be very dangerous. Next to Georgianne and her husband, the hardest hit by this horrendous news was Ethel, who was still recuperating from her own difficult pregnancy and delivery 3 months earlier. Ethel had hoped to get pregnant immediately. Okay, she literally just had a baby and it was a really hard delivery, but she's, got to keep up with the Kennedys. Now, having had contact with Georgianne, she faced the possibility of contracting the same dreaded disease. As always, in the face of adversity, Ethel went to church and prayed. Ethel's fears about the future were well-founded. Just 2 months after Georgianne's diagnosis, Ethel learned she was pregnant too. Not only did Ethel now fear for the health of the baby she was carrying, but other factors in her life were causing enormous stress for her. Despite all the people around her, Ethel felt isolated, mainly because she seemed to have little or no time with the most important person in her life. Virtually from the moment Kathleen was born 5 months earlier, Bobby had been traveling. Okay, Kathleen's 5 months old and she's already pregnant again. Can you even imagine it? Bobby, get off your wife. Let her recover, please. First, there was a trip to San Francisco arranged by his father to report on an international peace treaty involving Japan. Bobby was home only a short time before he left Ethel again, this time to accompany Jack, who was prepping himself for a planned senatorial race on an extended fact-finding trip through the Middle and Far East. Ethel had essentially been left to fend for herself, shuttling gypsy-like between the Skakels' house on Lake Avenue and the Kennedys' place in Hyannisport, because Bobby still hadn't settled on what he wanted to do and where he wanted to live. When he returned home from the trip with Jack, his father arranged through the good graces of Joe McCarthy to get Bobby a $4,200 a year job in the Justice Department's Internal Security Division. For a brief time, Ethel was joyous, thinking that her young family would finally have some permanency. But Bobby stayed in the job only 3 months, quitting to become Jack's Massachusetts senatorial campaign manager. As Rose Kennedy herself noted later, Ethel and Bobby had barely settled into their lives when the campaign started. Pregnant and anxious, Ethel was now expected to join the other Kennedy women on the stump. This would be her political coming out for the Kennedys, and she'd have to prove what she was made of. Ethel was scared, recalled Martin McNally, but Bobby put intense pressure on her to get involved in the campaign. To Bobby, Ethel's problems were secondary to Jack's political career. Bobby knew Jack's win or loss wouldn't hinge on whether Ethel was involved or not. It just boosted his ego to have her fat and pregnant and on the stump. He would point to her and say, "Look at the one I got." Like a faithful dog is what she became. It was as if Ethel had taken a blood oath. In the months since she'd been taken ill, Georgianne had tried to take her mind off the worst-case scenario. She'd even made plans, once the baby came, to attend the Republican National Convention scheduled to open in Chicago on July 7, 1952. Georgianne and the rest of the Skakels, except for Ethel, who was now an ordained Democrat, were hoping to finally see an end to the 20-year Democrat reign that had begun in 1933 with FDR's election. The Skakels had their money on Eisenhower and Nixon. But on June 21, 1952, Georgianne's and Ethel's worst nightmare came true. After being rushed to Greenwich Hospital, Georgianne gave birth to a daughter who was severely handicapped. The child, who was named Alexandra, was born deaf, blind, stunted, and retarded. When Ethel heard the news, a friend said that she made her hand into the shape of a gun and put it to her head, and then she cried. That's interesting. I don't really have much to say about that. But for the Skakels, with their strong Catholicism, pulling the plug was never a consideration. I should hope not. The child is... You don't just kill something that you don't like the look of. The doctors were instructed by Georgianne to allow the baby to live, no matter how defective it was, said Martin McNally. It? Georgianne, all of them, had an absolute conviction that they had no right to interfere with her life. I have to say I second the Skakels on that. The child is born. What, are you just going to snuff it out? Is this the Roman Empire? The christening, which under better circumstances would have been at St. Mary's, the Skakels church in Greenwich, where Ethel was married, was held for reasons of privacy at the Dowdalls' new home, a beautiful, elegantly furnished, antique-filled, Billy Baldwin-decorated English Cotswold manor, with stables, a guest house, a swimming pool, and tennis courts. It had been a recent gift to Georgianne from her parents. She had named the place Sursum Corda, a Latin phrase meaning lift up our hearts. We went out there for the christening and it was horrible, recalled Mary Begley. You could hear this poor little thing breathing all over the room because she probably should have been in an oxygen tent. She had terrible problems. We all saw her in Georgianne's bedroom and it was horrifying. All the Skakels were there. Ethel and Bobby, all of them. They were all stiff upper lip and let's make the best of it. Is this the way we talk about a poor child who's been born through no fault of her own with deficiencies? It was horrible. She looked terrible. She was disgusting, frightening. I mean, I can understand my heart going out to the poor little baby that can't breathe because it should have been an oxygen tent, but to describe it as horrifying? I don't know, y'all. I'm glad times have changed. This is not the way we can talk about folks. This is really upsetting. Ethel, who was 6 months pregnant, was visibly upset. Her hands were trembling and her lips were quivering, and I thought she'd fall apart, but she held herself together. Ethel, like all the Skakels, had the ability to hide her emotions, recalled a relative who was present. Ethel was a wreck. She looked at Alexandra, and I could tell that she was thinking about the baby she was carrying. She looked at Georgianne and was thinking, that could be me. I remember Bobby whispering, let's get out of here. For Bobby, Alexandra's birth reawakened horrible memories of his own sister, Rosemary, whom his father had quietly ordered lobotomized and institutionalized. Bobby distanced himself from the Skakels' problem with Alexandra, and as usual, Ethel obediently followed suit. As Martin McNally later observed, the Skakels now had their own Rosemary, but only the inner circle knew about it. Do we hate Martin McNally enough yet? I don't like that guy. I don't like the way he expresses himself. I don't. I think that he is crass and crude and rude. You know, talking about how Bobby just wanted Ethel. He wanted her there fat and pregnant and on the stump because, you know, I mean, even if that's true, is that the way we should say it? And then talking about the baby as it was defective. And, oh, now they've got their own Rosemary. Okay, so what if they do? What's the big problem, Martin? After the christening, Ethel never again saw her niece. Georgianne sought the help of medical experts, but nothing could be done for Alexandra. Georgianne also sought her family's counsel, including Ethel's, but a family insider said Ethel just didn't want to get involved. She didn't want to give her approval or disapproval. Bobby had told her it wasn't any of her business, and she did what he told her to do. It's none of your business to comfort your sister who now, you know, having a child with disabilities is difficult. You can't comfort your sister in this life-changing experience? Look, I'm not saying that this wouldn't be challenging because having a child with disabilities is challenging. But this idea, like this thought sort of floating around like, well, can you believe they didn't dispose of it? They didn't, but, you know, that was their belief. That was a crazy thought. I mean, we aren't barbarians here. And, you know, Bobby just being like, let's get away from it. You know, on the one hand, you want to say, as a pregnant couple, his wife's pregnant, she's pregnant. Of course, you would think, oh my goodness, this is so challenging and it would be scary. Like when you're pregnant, you're scared of everything. At least I was. I mean, I've never been an anxious person, but when I'm pregnant, I'm so anxious that something's going to happen with the baby and that they're going to struggle and, you know, they're going to be sick or something. I'm going to do something wrong and I'm going to mess something up and all this. I remember being a very nervous pregnant person, at least with some of my pregnancies. So I understand the fear related here, but for Bobby to be like, we wash our hands of that nastiness. And then on the other hand, they're always like, we really care about those who are limited in their intellectual capacities. We really want to fund and give money to, blah, blah, blah. It's like, I don't get the Kennedy deal when it comes to people who have different abilities. They seem like they talk with their mouth but do different with their actions. In late 1952, after much soul-searching, Georgie Ann had her baby placed in Ouville, a Catholic hospital for the terminally ill, near Boston. Georgie Ann, who would eventually have 6 children in 9 years, made a few visits but became so emotional each time she had to stop going. But a photograph of Alexandra was always on display in the library at Sursum Corda. Tragic births would continue to plague the Skakel family. Pat Skakel-Cuff's 8th and last daughter, Sarah, was born retarded, attributable to a lack of oxygen flow to the brain at birth. She, too, was eventually institutionalized. One of Pat's sons was born with a club foot like his mother, and one of Georgie Ann's sons was born with a similar deformity. Privately, Ethel always feared that she'd have a retarded or handicapped child, said a longtime friend. Now, as a side note, the book says that in September 1991, Alexandra died at age 39 of natural causes in Lowell, Massachusetts nursing home. Over the years, her institutionalization had cost the Skakel family $3 million. At the request of Alexandra's sister, little Georgie Ann, Ethel helped with the funeral arrangements, even forcing a Greenwich florist to open his shop at 2 a.m. so the flowers could be selected. The next day, Ethel stood with her head bowed, silently praying, as Alexandra was laid to rest in the Skakel family plot at St. Mary's Cemetery. Aunt Ethel told me after the service that Alexandra had weighed heavily on her through the years, little Georgie Ann said. Aunt Ethel said, "I don't think God will ever forgive me." Well, of course God will. God forgives us of all things. Can you forgive yourself for being the sort of person that would turn your back on your sister and her poor child? That's a greater question. God has the capacity to forgive us of everything. He already did when he sent his son. It's got nothing to do with it. But are you the sort of person that would turn your back on somebody in need? That's the question here. Anyway, in spite of the tragic birth of Alexandra, or perhaps because of it, a pregnant, heartbroken Ethel immersed herself wholeheartedly in Jack Kennedy's senatorial campaign. Through the summer of 1952, in the last months of her pregnancy, she campaigned vigorously in Massachusetts, helping Rose, Jean, Pat, and Eunice organize tea parties for potential voters and contributors. At just one event, the women purportedly served up more than 8,000 cups. Bobby, Ethel, and some of the other Kennedys and staffers had moved into a rooming house on Boston's Marble Street. Every night, Bobby and longtime Kennedy operative Kenneth O'Donnell went out and made speeches, while Ethel worked late at campaign headquarters, putting in 10 to 15-hour days. Ethel had just finished giving her first campaign spiel for Jack in the town of Fall River when she started to go into labor and was rushed to a Boston hospital where Kennedy family nurse Luella Hennessy worked. Ethel didn't say much about Alexandra, but I know it was causing her a lot of distress, recalled Hennessy, who met Ethel in the hospital and stayed with her through the delivery. On September 24, 1952, Ethel gave birth to her second child, a healthy boy. All her prayers had worked, stated Donovan. As soon as she was told the baby was fine, she visibly relaxed. Bobby was the one who wanted to name him after Joe, his brother who was killed in the war. Everyone was just so happy. 2 months later, there was reason for more joy among the Kennedys. In November 1952, by a slim margin of only 70,737 votes, Jack defeated third-term Massachusetts Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr. Nationally, the Skakels' presidential candidate, Dwight Eisenhower, won the White House. Lodge placed part of the blame for his loss on, quote, those damn tea parties that Ethel had been so active in organizing. As a note of thanks, Jack declared that Ethel helped, quote, drown Senator Lodge in 700 gallons of tea. Rose Kennedy said that the 33 teas the Kennedy girls gave were attended by some 70,000 guests. Close matching of the figures is, I dare say, coincidence, but I also think that the tea parties helped, said Rose. Ethel had soundly proven herself a political asset to Bobby and the Kennedy clan. Okay, now this last chapter is called Family Feud, and you know I've been waiting to get to this bit where the Kennedys and the Skakels start to clash. It's coming, you guys. It's here. Let's go. Well, endearing herself to the Kennedys, Ethel had all but alienated her own flesh and blood. The whole family's view was that Ethel had now become a Kennedy, period. And they were sad about that, said Mary Begley. They would have liked her to have been a little more loyal. As a result, the Skakels were very cavalier about the Kennedys. Ethel's sister-in-law, Virginia, who had married Jim Skakel about a month before Georgie Ann gave birth to Alexandra, expressed a few years later that the Kennedys, Bobby in particular, acted superior to the Skakels and often showed outright contempt for them. In all those years, Bobby probably said only 3 words to me. I only saw Rose Kennedy at the Skakel house once in the 2 years I lived there, and that was a brief visit. So the Skakels didn't give a damn whether Jack won or lost the Massachusetts senatorial race, and they didn't care about Ethel's involvement in the campaign. The only talk about the Kennedys was the jokes the Skakels made about them. There was no closeness between the two families at all. At one point, the Kennedys threw a big costume party at the Plaza Hotel in New York to raise money for their favorite charity, retarded children. Some of the Skakels went for kicks. It was the first time Joe and Rose appeared in the same party in years, and we were all in a state of shock, one of them recalled. Teddy was there making a complete horse's ass out of himself. They had Nat King Cole entertain, and Teddy, wearing a cowboy hat, stepped up to the mic and started singing. He looked like a complete idiot. We thought the Kennedys were a bunch of dolts. Okay, tell us what you really think there. Ethel's brother, George, once participated in a regatta with Jack Kennedy off Martha's Vineyard. Jack was at the helm of the boat, shouting orders to George on how to adjust the sails. Ethel's brothers believed that if he followed Kennedy's commands, they'd lose rather than win the race. In his tough guy manner, Skakel turned to Kennedy and said, "Look, Jack, are you going to keep screaming at me on how to trim that sail, when I know damn well better than you how it ought to be trimmed?" Jack Kennedy glared at Skakel. "Shut the hell up and do what you're told," the former PT-109 skipper barked. With that, George Skakel Jr. gave Jack Kennedy the finger and jumped overboard, swimming 2 miles ashore, leaving Kennedy furious and without a crew. To tick off Ethel, meanwhile, the Skakels took great pleasure in making fun of Bobby in front of her. They called Bobby Booby, chuckled Mary Begley years later, and they used to call Joe Kennedy Old Monkey Glands. What is wrong with these people? I don't understand. Big Ann harbored their most disdain for the Kennedys. And, as a result, her relationship with Ethel deteriorated steadily in the early 1950s. She found Joe Kennedy's private life, mainly his womanizing and his marital arrangement with Rose, morally repugnant. As a staunch Catholic, Big Ann saw him as a venial, licentious reprobate who would never repent for his sins. He was, in her mind, a religious hypocrite, a rogue Catholic who was an insult to her staunch religious beliefs. She'd also lost any respect she might have had for Rose. Big Ann had little or no regard for Rose, because Joe was out and around town, messing around all the time, and very flagrant, said Joe McCooey, who would marry Ethel's sister Ann. Big Ann couldn't stand the fact that Rose was a tool of Joe's. Big Ann was never a tool of George's. Big Ann's worst fear was that Bobby had inherited his father's genes. It made her both sad for and angry at Ethel. "Why did I ever let her marry into that family?" was her constant refrain. Another trait of the Kennedys that grated on the Skakels was their notorious cheapness. It wasn't long after they were married that Bobby began nagging Ethel about money. Her extravagance would be a source of irritation and conflict throughout their marriage. When Ethel's bills began flowing in from stores in Palm Beach, New York, and Boston, Rose Kennedy ordered Bobby to get his bride in line. Bobby's warnings, however, were met with blank stares from Ethel, who had no conception whatsoever about budgeting money. When one of the Kennedys called to tell her that her checking account was overdrawn, Ethel was shocked. "It can't be," she responded with all innocence. "I still have some checks left." Poor dimwit. One evening at the dinner table at Hyannisport, Joe Kennedy angrily brought up the subject of frivolous spending. Glaring, he turned to Ethel and declared her the worst of the lot, a wild spender with no regard for the value of a dollar. Knowing that Joe's angry criticism would devastate Ethel, she'd been working so hard to earn his respect, Bobby told his father that his point had been well taken. But Ethel jumped up from the table and ran from the room, tears brimming in her eyes, her face crimson with embarrassment. I mean, in Ethel's defense, is it her fault that she doesn't know the value of a dollar, that she doesn't know how to curb spending? Has anybody ever taught her any of that? She'd been allowed to do that her whole life. Her whole life she'd been allowed to spend anything she wanted. That's not her fault that that's how she wants to do now in life. I mean, it does seem like she might be able to figure out how a bank account works. That business about the checks is a little unfortunate. But on the whole, is it her fault that she had been conditioned to spend like that and nobody had ever tried to curb her spending or say, hey, one day you might be married to somebody who doesn't make this kind of money, so you need to be a little bit more careful about how you're spending your money. No, nobody had ever bothered to set her up for a future where, you're not living like a king all day long. Anyway, despite her conflict with her daughter, Big Ann was livid when she learned how Ethel was being treated. On one occasion, she angrily telephoned Rose and warned, "If Bobby can't treat Ethel in the manner which she's accustomed, we'll just take her back." Ever so often, Big Ann gave a luncheon for some of the other mothers-in-law, gatherings that Rose rarely attended. But one afternoon, the Kennedy matriarch arrived at Lake Avenue for a showdown. Mrs. Kennedy came specifically to try to curb Ethel's spending, and Big Ann wanted no part of the curbing, recalled Joe McCooey, whose mother, along with a half a dozen of other women, were present for the show. Rose told Big Ann that Ethel was spending too much and that she'd have to cut it out immediately. And Big Ann said, "I thought you Kennedys had nothing but money. If Ethel wants to spend and Bobby's supposed to be so rich, then let Ethel spend." Rose said, "But Bobby doesn't have any money." Rose was angry and nervous. She kept getting up and she'd walk around complaining about Ethel's spending, and then she'd sit back down again and continue her harangue. When Rose left, Big Ann and the others sat around the table for another hour, laughing their heads off. We later found out that Rose was there at Joe's urging, but Big Ann won because Ethel kept on spending. Jim and Virginia Skakel experienced the Kennedys' frugalness as they were checking into a bungalow at the Beverly Hills Hotel. When Virginia Skakel gave the bell captain a $10 tip, he looked shocked. "Aren't you Mrs. Skakel? The Skakels who are related to the Kennedys?" When she said she was, he confided, "Not one of us will pick up one of the Kennedys' bags. They don't give us more than a 50-cent tip. The last time I told one of them, 'Keep it. You need it more than I do.' Why are they the way that they are with all that money they have?" Giggling, Virginia responded, "Sometimes I think that's why they have so much money and I don't." Rose continually rode Ethel about her financial irresponsibility, sending her notes detailing where to get the best bargains, along with coupons that she'd clipped. Once, Rose noticed an expensive clock on a night table in a maid's room at Ethel's house. Furious, she took Ethel aside. "You could get a good electric clock for $4.95. Big Ann felt that the Kennedys had undermined her mother-daughter bond. "I barely know Ethel anymore since she got in with that crowd," she confided to Martin McNally. "She's becoming a stranger to me." But neither Ethel nor her mother confronted the problem. When Ethel did make one of her infrequent visits home, Big Ann often berated her in front of the family and guests, yelling at Ethel to clean up her room or make her bed, treating her like a naughty child rather than a young mother married to a son of one of America's most powerful families. "I couldn't believe it," Virginia Skakel said. "It was definitely weird." While Rose bristled over Ethel's spending habits, she also found her daughter-in-law charming, vivacious, completely loyal, competitive, tough, and as devout a Catholic as herself. Rose accepted Ethel as one of her own. Ethel's relationship with her father was paramount. She respected and loved him tremendously, Virginia Skakel observed later. They went on long walks together in the woods. I remember seeing Ethel when she was very pregnant, walking with her dad hand in hand. There was a great attachment with her father, while her mother screamed at Ethel all the time. Years later, Ethel recalled her father as reflective and extremely kind, probably the best Christian soul I ever knew, an extraordinary human being. She also recalls their walks, which she found somewhat tedious. He'd stop and you'd have to admire a tree until it drove you bonkers. In the end, though, Ethel would live her life more like her mother. Ethel's decision in the early 1950s to drastically cut her family ties had much to do with Bobby's feelings about the Skakels. Bobby had reached a point where he couldn't stand being in the presence of any of them, recalled a longtime Kennedy confidant. "I remember him once telling Dean Markham, 'If I wasn't married to Ethel, I wouldn't give those mixed the time of day.'" Bobby knew he'd never be fully accepted in the insular Skakels. But according to Martin McNally, Bobby didn't care. His whole attitude was, "I have brothers, I have sisters, I have parents, I have money, I have power, I have prestige, I don't need you people." He was an arrogant son of a bitch. But Ethel was madly in love with him. His family made him even more attractive to her. She wanted to please him in every way. In Bobby's estimation, the Skakels were loose cannons with the potential for scandal that could impact the Kennedys adversely. Ethel knew her family's potential for mischief better than anyone. The Kennedys' apprehension would prove to be well-founded. And that is the end of today's reading. Ugh, I just could go on and on. I'm so into this book, it's not even funny. I love it. I love every bit of it, and I hope you do too. But I am well past when I told myself I'd finish reading, and oh my goodness gracious, I gotta go. But it was so fun hanging out with you guys. I hope you're loving this as much as me, and the juicy, juicy drama is only getting better. All right, I'll see you guys later. Thanks so much for hanging out. Bye.